Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss the concept that Reform UK may have been stealing your personal data, including very sensitive data. It's from anyone who has visited their website, potentially over the past 2 years, and passing it on to Facebook for marketing, but also maybe using it for political purposes as well. The case is being investigated by the Information Commissioner. But this may be another case of where the new government really, if they're going to restore trust in politics, are going to need to launch another inquiry or build it into an existing inquiry in order to rebuild the remains of our system after so many years of abuse under the Tories. Because this has, for me, real echoes of Cambridge Analytica from 2016, which was so effective in both the Brexit referendum in the UK and then the presidential election, which powered the Orange one to power, using people's personal data to build up an image of their views and beliefs, working out who would be the most vulnerable to changing their vote, then hitting them with targeted disinformation, seemingly from different sources to provide confirmation bias. It resulted in a fine of billions for Facebook in the United States for their role in it, and Cambridge Analytica shut down, although the reason they shut down was to avoid investigators grabbing more of their files and really digging deep. The work they were doing didn't end there. And so when you hear of an organisation owned and led by Nigel Farage, who was very much part of the disinformation web of 2016 on both sides of the Atlantic, running a website which was harvesting personal data without the consent of users, we should take note. For anyone not really paying attention before, the country has already been given a harsh lesson in the consequences of allowing disinformation. There are lots of lessons we should seek to learn from the far-right riots, lessons for the government, for the police, for social media companies, but for the public as well. One of them is that disinformation is incredibly harmful. So what is the specific issue with Reform UK here? Well, when people visited the Reform UK website, tracking tools were collecting browsing data. So while you were on the Reform UK site, this tool was harvesting information on the other sites that you'd been browsing. And you may think, well, I didn't give them permission to do that. No, and you need to, but they didn't. According to reports in The Observer, it did this not only without the user's consent, but sometimes even if the user expressly denied consent. This tracking tool was used for about 2 years. And the report also says that when the Observer approached Reform UK about it or asked them questions about it, they stopped using it, suggesting they know it's wrong to do so. And as you'd imagine, most people checking out the Reform UK website are going to be people who support the party and Nigel Farage. Not all, of course. So what you've got here is a case of Farage once again abusing his own supporters, largely. I don't know how many times I have to say it. He's got no regard for people, any people. You know, they're all just cattle to him. Since being elected, I mean, look, what has he done as an MP? He hasn't set up a constituency office in Clacton. He doesn't do surgeries, doesn't visit there. Last week, there was a huge fire raged through several properties. Big problem in his constituency. Local MP should be going along to go, oh, this is terrible. I'm going to, make sure I'm keeping up to tabs with what's going on here. None of that. Didn't go there. Didn't even mention it as far as I can tell. Hasn't really attended Parliament very much. He's just taken his supporters for a ride and they're letting him. The data then that was harvested was passed on to Meta for marketing purposes, as well as used by Reform UK for their own targeted advertising, which will be bad enough in many people's minds. But there are a couple of other things to consider. The first is the data can also be used. There's no proof it has been used for this, but if you believe it hasn't, I think I have a bridge to sell you. But it could be used, Cambridge Analytica style, to build up a political profile of the user. And these data get extra protections under our laws because of the serious harm that can result from misusing information like that. Like I say, in 2016, we know it was used to get people to vote for Brexit and for Trump based on disinformation being targeted at those people. And because they'd built up profiles of the people being targeted, they knew exactly which messages would be the most likely to work. It was a very sophisticated operation of propaganda. And we keep talking about Cambridge Analytica because they were the ones shown to be guilty of using these techniques. But the techniques didn't die with them. They just continued to be used and abused. We just haven't had a major crackdown on it from any government or international body. Another thing to consider is that the Observer article makes the point that Reform UK claim their anti-surveillance, their manifesto, which they called a contract. Oh, we don't have a manifesto, we have a contract. Oh, really? But anyway, this manifesto stroke contract said that surveillance of the public must be limited and those monitoring held to account. Well, Farage has been conducting surveillance of the public for about 2 years without their consent, in a way which may prove to be unlawful. There's not much that Farage calls for that I think we should indulge. I might make an exception here. I think we should do what Nigel Farage suggests and hold him to account for this. But what I definitely feel the government need to do is make sure that a review is launched, or that this aspect of it is built into another review that's going to go on into the illicit gathering and misuse of data like this. Because think about what's likely to happen. So let's say the Information Commissioner concludes that the practice was indeed unlawful. What's going to happen? Reform UK get a fine. The fines can be, in theory, quite large, but they're still fines. It's money. For wealthy people, it's a fee for breaking the law. You know, as with so many dishonest acts, we really have to start realising that fines don't work too well on wealthy people. In fact, do you know what? A lot of the time, I often think, you know, when you look at, say, abuse of, say, benefits, and, there's plenty of people who are very poor who end up going to prison. And then you think about, so what happens at the upper end? What happens when people don't just fiddle the state out of 20, 30,000 pounds, but, 10 million, 20 million, something like that? Or they get a fine. It's always a fine for the wealthy, isn't it? And it's almost like it's deliberate. There needs to be real consequences. When there are people out there so wealthy that they'd rather be fined £1 million than go to prison for even like 3 months, what's the point in a fine? Because part of the point of a punishment is the deterrent factor. We don't want to punish people. We want them to stop doing the thing in the first place. If we still have people stealing and misusing personal data, potentially to rig elections, years after the 2016 behaviour was exposed, I think that was 2017 when it all blew up, then the deterrent factor is clearly missing, because the punishments themselves are not the aim. Even if everyone involved in the Reform UK data harvesting was thrown in prison for the rest of their lives, the damage is still done. All you've done is stop them carrying out the same damage later on. We need a system which punishes the people involved, not for the sake of punishment, but to stop them thinking that the risk is worth it in the first place. Because right now, the risk is worth it for them. The absolute worst thing that can happen to those at Reform UK is they get a fine. Well, we've seen how that works with GB News. Doesn't really work too well. For a bunch of multimillionaires backed by funding of unknown sources, running an operation which makes losses, and some of those dodgy sources of funding could be from out of the country, given the army of Russian bots that they had at their service during the election campaign, a fine's not really going to trouble them for a second. As for Reform's excuse, they used the Tory excuse. Do you know what they said? They're talking about it. Oh no, we weren't stealing your data. It was just a cock-up, they said. So they're claiming the incompetence defence. And again, I keep saying, it's the same thing I say to Conservative supporters. Why are you supporting them? Why do you support Nigel Farage? Oh, because he's got best interests at heart. He's dodgy as hell. We keep catching him out with these dodgy things. Oh, yeah, but he says it was an accident. So he's incompetent. He's saying he's incompetent then. Why are you backing him? Even if there are plenty of well-meaning idiots in this world. They're really nice people. They've got best intentions. You wouldn't put them in charge of the country. So it doesn't really matter whether you think Nigel Farage is dodgy or incompetent. It's not a reason to support him either way. But it wasn't just a cock-up. Like hell, it was a cock-up. They also said they never used the data to influence voting behaviour, in which case there should be no problem with a serious inquiry being launched then, yeah? Because if the government wants to prevent the spread of disinformation, which caused the recent riots, and avoid similar attempts to destabilise society in the future, there's going to need to be a much more robust defence in the online world. There are, of course, calls for the government to launch a major inquiry into the causes of the riots. This is because, in reality, there are a lot of underlying causes. People are worried that we might end up focusing on one at the exclusion of the others, which, absolutely I agree is a big risk. Labour have already said they'll review the Online Safety Act to see where improvements may need to be made. But that will also need to take account of not just the way the online space was used to fuel and organise this specific violence, but how it may have been used and abused over a great many years building up to this, how it may be abused more generally for political purposes, including during election campaigns. Because both Reform UK and the Tories posted a lot of disinformation during the election campaign. And that needs tackling, because it would be amazing to me if we ended up a year or two down the line after some big review of these riots, concluding that disinformation needs to be tackled. And yet there was this big elephant in the room of, but what about disinformation during an actual election campaign, which is actually the most serious? That's surely got to be tackled as well. Because if Reform UK were stealing personal information to help with their campaign, that needs tackling. Labour say that tackling the far right and the populism of Nigel Farage is a priority of theirs. Well, if it is a priority, they cannot afford to ignore something like this. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.